Imagine walking through the narrow cobblestone streets of 14th century Europe. The air is thick with the stench of death and decay. Bodies lie rotting in doorways. Entire families have been wiped out overnight. And then you see him. A figure emerges from the morning fog, dressed entirely in black leather from head to toe. His face is completely hidden behind a grotesque bird-like mask with a long, curved beak that extends nearly a foot from his face. Dark glass goggles cover his eyes, making him look more like a demon than a human being. In his gloved hand, he carries a long wooden stick that he uses to poke at the bodies of the dead and dying. This is not some medieval nightmare or gothic horror story. This was the daily reality for men who chose one of history's most terrifying occupations, the plague doctor. Tonight, we're going to explore what it was really like to live and work as one of these mysterious figures who walked among the dead during Europe's darkest hours. We'll discover how ordinary men were transformed into these bird-like creatures, what their daily routines looked like as they moved from house to house, treating the incurable, and why this profession was considered not just dangerous, but cursed by God himself. So settle in, get comfortable, and prepare to enter the world of medieval medicine, where helping the sick meant accepting your own death sentence, and where the cure was often worse than the disease itself. The making of a plague doctor, 3 o'clock to 15 o'clock, how ordinary men became medieval death walkers. The path to becoming a plague doctor wasn't something most men chose willingly. During the Great Plagues that swept across Europe from the 14th to the 17th centuries, these positions were often filled by desperate men who had exhausted all other options for survival. The desperate and the damned most plague doctors came from 4 main groups of society. The first were failed medical students who had been expelled from universities for various infractions, but still possessed some basic knowledge of anatomy and medicine. These men found themselves unemployable in normal medical practice, but could still command respect during plague outbreaks when any medical knowledge was desperately needed. The second group consisted of barber surgeons who had lost their regular clientele due to scandal, incompetence, or simply bad luck. During normal times, these men made their living cutting hair, pulling teeth, and performing minor surgeries. But when plague struck and people were dying by the thousands, even the most incompetent barber surgeon could find work. The third category was perhaps the most tragic: clergy members who had been defrocked or had lost their faith entirely. These men often possessed literacy and some education, making them more qualified than most to read medical texts and understand basic treatments. Many had also lost everything they cared about to previous plague outbreaks and saw this work as a form of penance or even suicide. Finally, there were the criminals and debtors who were given a choice between death and serving as plague doctors. Many medieval courts offered convicted felons the option of plague duty instead of execution. Given that both options usually led to death, many criminals chose plague work because it at least offered the possibility of survival and redemption. Asterisk. The training process, the training to become a plague doctor, was remarkably brief and largely octade, and largely practical. In most European cities, the position was appointed by local authorities who were desperate to have anyone willing to treat plague victims and provide official death confirmations. New plague doctors would typically spend 2 to 3 days learning from an experienced practitioner, if one was still alive. This training consisted primarily of learning how to properly don and remove the protective costume, how to identify different stages of plague progression, and what treatments were considered standard. The medical knowledge they received was primitive and often completely wrong by modern standards. They learned that plague was caused by miasma, or bad air, and that it could be prevented by carrying strong-smelling herbs and avoiding direct contact with patients. They were taught to balance the body's humors through bloodletting, purging, and the application of various poultices and ointments. Most importantly, they learned the bureaucratic aspects of the job. Plague doctors were required to keep detailed records of every patient they saw, every treatment they administered, and every death they witnessed. These records were crucial for city authorities trying to track the spread of disease and make decisions about quarantines and trade restrictions. The oath and the contract. Before beginning their work, plague doctors took a formal oath administered by city officials or church authorities. This oath bound them to serve faithfully until the end of the plague outbreak, regardless of personal danger. They swore to treat all patients equally, regardless of social status or ability to pay, and to provide honest reports about the progression of the disease. The contractual arrangements were surprisingly detailed for the medieval period. Plague. Doctors typically received a guaranteed salary from the city, plus additional payments for each patient treated and each death officially confirmed. They were also provided with housing, food, and medical supplies, though the quality of these provisions was often poor. Most contracts included specific clauses about behavior and conduct. Plague doctors were forbidden from fleeing the city. During outbreaks, prohibited from spreading panic through their reports, and required to maintain their protective equipment in good condition. Violation of these terms could result in immediate execution, though enforcement was often difficult given the chaos of plague outbreaks. The contracts also addressed the likelihood of the doctor's own death. Detailed instructions were provided for the disposal of the plague doctor's body and possessions, and provisions were made for any family members left behind. These grim practicalities were a constant reminder of the Job's deadly nature, social status, and isolation from the moment. They accepted the position. Plague doctors became social outcasts. Even though their work was officially sanctioned and desperately needed, they were viewed with a mixture of fear, suspicion, and superstitious dread by the general population. Plague doctors were required to live apart from their families and the general community. They were assigned special housing, usually abandoned buildings or structures on the outskirts of town. This isolation served both practical and psychological purposes. It reduced the risk of spreading infection, but it also reflected the belief that plague doctors had been touched by death itself. Their social isolation was enforced through elaborate rules and customs. Plague doctors were prohibited from entering churches, markets, or any public gatherings. They could not touch healthy people or handle food that would be consumed by others. Even their money was considered contaminated and had to be purified through various rituals before it could be spent. The psychological impact of this isolation was devastating. Many plague doctors reported feeling like living ghosts, moving through a world where they were simultaneously essential and reviled. Letters and journals from the period describe the profound loneliness and despair that came with the position. The point of no return once a man became a plague doctor. Returning to normal life was virtually impossible. Even if he survived a plague outbreak, he would be forever marked as someone who had walked among the dead and the dying. Former plague doctors found it extremely difficult to reintegrate into society, marry, or pursue other occupations. Many plague doctors who survived their service became wanderers, moving from city to city as new outbreaks occurred. They developed a grim expertise in plague management that made them valuable during epidemics, but unemployable during healthy times. Some formed informal networks, sharing information about effective treatments and warning each other about dangerous situations. The transformation from ordinary man to plague doctor was not just professional, but existential. The work changed men fundamentally, stripping away their connections to normal human society and forcing them to confront death and suffering on a scale that few people in human history have experienced. The costume of death, 15 o'clock to 25 minutes and 0 seconds, the terrifying uniform that defined medieval horror. The plague doctor's costume is one of the most recognizable and frightening images from medieval history, but few people understand the practical and psychological purposes behind each element of this bizarre outfit. Every piece of the costume served specific functions. though many were based on medieval misunderstandings about how disease spread. The iconic beak mask, the most distinctive feature of the plague doctor's costume, was the enormous beak-like mask that extended up to 18 inches from the face. This grotesque appendage wasn't designed to terrorize people, though it certainly had that effect. Instead, it was based on the medieval theory that plague was spread through miasma or corrupted air. The beak was hollow and filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and sometimes dried flowers. Common substances included rosemary, thyme, lavender, mint, cloves, cinnamon, and dried roses. The theory was that these strong scents would purify the air before it reached the doctor's lungs, filtering out the corrupted vapors that supposedly caused plague. The beak also contained practical features that made the doctor's work easier. Small holes near the tip allowed for breathing, while the interior was designed with channels that would direct airflow over the aromatic substances. Some beaks included crude filters made from cloth or animal hair to prevent larger particles from entering. The psychological effect of the beak was both intentional and accidental. While it was primarily designed for protection, doctors quickly realized that the frightening appearance helped maintain social distance. People would automatically stay far away from the bird-like figure, reducing the risk of infection through close contact. The construction of these masks was expensive and time-consuming. Skilled leather workers or mask makers would craft them from thick leather, often boiled to make it harder and more durable. The beak portion was usually reinforced with wood or metal supports to maintain its shape and prevent collapse during use. The dark glass eyes, the eyepieces of the plague doctor mask, were made from dark glass or crystal, giving the wearer an inhuman, insect-like appearance. These weren't just aesthetic choices, but served practical purposes that reflected medieval understanding of disease transmission. Medieval physicians believed that plague could enter the body through the eyes, particularly through direct eye contact with infected patients. The dark glass was thought to provide a barrier against these dangerous emanations, while still allowing the doctor to see well enough to perform examinations. The glass also protected against bright light and dust, which was important given the long hours doctors spent outdoors examining bodies and visiting infected houses. The dark tint reduced eye strain and provided some protection against flying debris during house-to-house visits. From a psychological perspective, the dark glass eyepieces were perhaps the most unsettling part of the costume. They completely dehumanized the doctor, making it impossible for patients to make eye contact or read facial expressions. This created an emotional barrier that helped doctors maintain professional distance, but also increased the terror felt by patients and their families. The full-body leather covering plague doctors wore full-length leather coats that extended from neck to ankle, often with additional leather leggings and boots. This wasn't medieval fashion, but a carefully designed protective system based on the belief that plague could penetrate fabric and infect through skin contact. The leather was typically thick, often from cows or horses, and was treated with oils and waxes that medieval doctors believed would repel plague-causing agents. The surface was usually dark brown or black, partly for practical reasons. Dark colors showed dirt and contamination less obviously, and partly because these colors were associated with death and medical authority. The coat included several practical features that aren't immediately obvious. Deep pockets held medical instruments, herbs, and small containers for medicines. Reinforced areas at the elbows and knees provided extra protection during patient examinations. Some coats included removable sections that could be replaced or cleaned more easily. The full coverage provided by the leather coat meant that plague doctors were essentially wearing a personal isolation chamber. No part of their body was exposed to potential contamination, which gave them confidence to work in highly infected environments that would terrify normal people. The protective accessories beyond the main elements of the costume. Plague doctors carried several additional protective items that completed their terrifying appearance. While serving practical medical functions, every plague doctor carried a long wooden or metal rod, usually 6 to 8 feet in length. This served multiple purposes. It allowed doctors to examine patients without direct physical contact, could be used to move bedding or clothing, and helped maintain social distance when walking through crowds. The rod also served as a walking stick during long days of house-to-house visits. Leather gloves extended well up the forearms and were often reinforced with additional layers at the fingertips and palms. These were considered essential protection against contamination from handling infected patients and materials. The gloves were regularly cleaned with vinegar or wine, which medieval doctors believed had purifying properties. Many plague doctors wore wide-brimmed hats made from leather or thick felt, which provided additional protection for the head and neck. These hats often included religious symbols or medical insignia that identified the wearer's official status and authority. The ritual of dressing, putting on the plague doctor costume, was an elaborate ritual that could take an hour or more to complete properly. This wasn't vanity, but necessity. A single mistake in the dressing process could mean death from infection. The process began with purification rituals that varied by region and personal belief. Some doctors would wash with vinegar or wine, while others might burn incense or recite prayers. These rituals served both practical and psychological purposes, providing some actual cleansing while helping doctors mentally prepare for the dangerous work ahead. Each piece of the costume had to be put on in a specific order to ensure maximum protection. The leather coat went on first, followed by the gloves, then the mask, and finally the hat and accessories. Every seam and opening had to be checked to ensure there were no gaps where contamination could enter. The removal process was even more critical and dangerous. Contaminated clothing had to be removed in reverse order while avoiding any contact with clean skin or clothing. Many plague doctors died not from treating patients, but from contaminating themselves during the removal process. The psychological impact of the costume. While the plague doctor costume was designed for protection, its psychological effects were equally important to understanding how these men did their terrifying work. The costume served as both shield and prison, protecting the doctor while cutting him off from normal human contact. From the doctor's perspective, the costume provided crucial psychological distance from the horror of his work. The physical barrier created an emotional barrier that helped him maintain professional composure while surrounded by death and suffering. Many doctors reported feeling like they were watching someone else's life when they worked in the costume. However, the isolation imposed by the costume also contributed to the psychological breakdown that many plague doctors experienced. Unable to communicate normally with patients or receive comfort from human contact, doctors often developed severe depression and anxiety disorders. The costume also transformed how others perceived and interacted with plague doctors. The inhuman appearance inspired fear and respect, but also hatred and suspicion. Many people believed that the costume itself was cursed, or that wearing it would inevitably lead to damnation. Daily rounds with death 25 minutes and 0 seconds to 40 minutes and 0 seconds. The horrifying routine of medieval medical practice. A plague doctor's typical day began before dawn and often extended well past midnight. Their daily routine was a carefully choreographed dance with death that required both medical knowledge and psychological fortitude that few humans possess. The morning preparations each day started with the elaborate process of donning the protective costume, followed by the preparation of medical supplies and treatments. Plague doctors had to prepare their own medicines since most apothecaries had either fled or died during outbreaks. The medicine preparation process was based on medieval theories about balancing bodily humors and purging corrupted blood. Doctors would mix various herbal concoctions, prepare bloodletting equipment, and create poultices from combinations of herbs, animal fats, and sometimes human or animal waste ingredients that modern medicine recognizes as often more harmful than helpful. Common treatments included theriac, a complex mixture of dozens of ingredients, including viper's flesh that was believed to be a universal antidote to poison and disease. Doctors also prepared various purging agents designed to expel corrupted humors through vomiting and diarrhea. Treatments that often killed weakened patients faster than the plague itself. House-to-house visitations, the core of a plague doctor's work, involved visiting infected households to examine patients, provide treatments, and confirm deaths. These visits followed strict protocols designed to maximize efficiency while minimizing infection risk. Upon arriving at a house, the plague doctor would announce his presence by striking his wooden rod against the door or ground. Family members were required to maintain a distance of at least 6 feet while describing the patient's condition. The doctor would then enter the house alone, leaving family members outside to prevent further contamination. Inside infected houses, plague doctors encountered scenes of horror that would traumatize modern medical professionals. Entire families often lay dying in their own waste, their bodies covered with the characteristic black buboes that gave the Black Death its name. The stench of death, disease, and human waste was overwhelming even through the aromatic herbs in the doctor's mask. Patient examinations were conducted using the long wooden rod to avoid direct contact. Doctors would use the rod to lift clothing, check pulse points, and examine buboes and other symptoms. They carried small mirrors attached to the end of their rods to get better views of patients' throats and mouths without getting close enough to be breathed on. The brutal treatments, medieval plague treatments, were often more torturous than the disease itself, reflecting the era's primitive understanding of medicine and the desperate attempts to combat an incurable condition. Bloodletting was the most common treatment, based on the theory that plague was caused by corrupted blood that needed to be drained from the body. Plague doctors would use the pointed end of their rod to open veins, allowing infected blood to flow into containers that were later buried or burned. Severely weakened patients often died immediately from the blood loss. Lancing buboes was another standard treatment that caused excruciating pain while providing no real medical benefit. Doctors would use heated knives to cut open the swollen lymph nodes, draining the infected pus and often causing fatal secondary infections. The screams from patients undergoing this procedure could be heard throughout entire neighborhoods. Purging treatments designed to expel corrupted humors through vomiting and defecation were administered regularly. These treatments used powerful laxatives and emetics that left patients severely dehydrated and weakened. Many patients who might have survived the plague died from the effects of these cures. Recording the dead, a significant portion of the plague doctor's daily routine, involved confirming and recording deaths. This bureaucratic function was crucial for city authorities, trying to track the spread of disease and make decisions about quarantines and resource allocation. Death confirmation required careful examination of bodies to verify that plague was indeed the cause of death. Doctors had to document the location and extent of buboes, note the condition of the body, and estimate how long the person had been dead. This information was recorded in detailed logs that were submitted to city authorities. The bodies of plague victims required special handling procedures that added to the horror of the doctor's daily routine. Corpses had to be moved using the wooden rod to avoid direct contact, and clothing and bedding had to be examined for signs of continued infection. Bodies showing signs of rapid decomposition or unusual swelling required immediate burial to prevent further contamination. Isolation procedures. Plague doctors were responsible for implementing and enforcing quarantine measures, a duty that often put them in conflict with desperate families trying to care for infected relatives. When a house was declared infected, the plague doctor would mark it with a large red cross painted on the door, along with the words, "Lord, have mercy on us." The house would then be sealed, with healthy family members locked inside with the infected for a period of 40 days, a quarantine period that often resulted in the death of entire families. Enforcing these quarantine measures required plague doctors to ignore the pleas and bribes of desperate families who wanted to escape isolation. Many doctors reported that turning away from crying children and begging parents was more psychologically damaging than treating the disease itself. Evening documentation each day ended with extensive record keeping that documented every patient seen, every treatment administered, and every death confirmed. These records were required by city authorities and often represented the only historical documentation of individual plague victims. The evening documentation process forced plague doctors to relive the day's horrors as they wrote detailed descriptions of each patient's condition and response to treatment. Many doctors' journals from this period reveal the psychological toll of this daily confrontation with mass death and human suffering, the accumulating horror day after day, week after week. Plague doctors witnessed levels of human suffering that were unprecedented in European history. Entire neighborhoods would be wiped out, leaving only empty houses and streets filled with corpses. The accumulated psychological impact of this routine exposure to mass death was devastating. Many plague doctors' personal writings describe a gradual loss of emotional response to human suffering. After seeing hundreds or thousands of deaths, they reported feeling numb to individual tragedies and began to view human beings more as medical specimens than as people with families and dreams. The daily routine of moving from house to house, treating the untreatable, and confirming death after death created a unique form of psychological trauma that had no precedent in human experience. These men became living bridges between the world of the healthy and the realm of the dead, occupying a space that no human was meant to inhabit. The curse of survival, 40 minutes and 0 seconds to 50 minutes and 0 seconds psychological breakdown and social exile. While the physical dangers of being a plague doctor were obvious and immediate, the psychological and social consequences were often more devastating and longer lasting. Those who survived their service faced challenges that modern society would recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, complicated by complete social rejection. The mental breakdown plague doctors who survived long enough to complete their service often emerged psychologically shattered. The daily exposure to mass death, combined with the isolation imposed by their protective costume and social status, created psychological damage that was irreversible by medieval standards. Many plague doctors developed what medieval writers described as melancholia, a condition characterized by severe depression, anxiety, and obsessive thoughts about death. They would often continue to see plague symptoms in healthy people, report hearing the cries of plague victims long after outbreaks ended, and experience vivid nightmares about their work. The isolation imposed by the protective costume contributed significantly to psychological breakdown. Spending months unable to touch another human being, unable to see people's faces clearly, and unable to communicate normally created a profound disconnection from humanity. Many doctors reported feeling like they'd become the bird-like creatures their costumes made them appear to be. Personal writings from surviving plague doctors reveal the depth of their psychological damage. Many wrote about feeling dead inside, about losing the ability to experience normal human emotions, and about viewing healthy people as temporary beings who were simply awaiting their turn to die. The guilt of survival, perhaps the most psychologically damaging aspect of plague doctor service, was the guilt that came with survival. In communities where 30 to 60% of the population died from plague, surviving plague doctors had to grapple with questions about why they lived when so many others died. Many plague doctors developed survivor's guilt that manifested as a belief that they deserved to die for their inability to save their patients. The primitive treatments available meant that virtually every patient a plague doctor treated would die, creating a sense of professional failure that was psychologically devastating. Religious guilt added another layer of psychological torment. Many plague doctors began to believe that their survival meant they were cursed by God, or that they had made some kind of pact with evil forces. The medieval association between disease and divine punishment meant that surviving a plague outbreak, while being intimately involved with the disease, could be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption, social rejection, and permanent exile, even after plague outbreaks ended. Former plague doctors found themselves permanently excluded from normal society. The fear and superstition surrounding their work meant that they were viewed as contaminated, beings who could never again be trusted around healthy people. Former plague doctors were prohibited from most forms of employment. They couldn't work in food preparation, childcare, or any occupation that involved close contact with the public. Many trades and guilds had explicit rules excluding anyone who had served as a plague doctor regardless of their previous qualifications or experience. Marriage and family life became virtually impossible for former plague doctors. Few families would allow their daughters to marry men who had been intimately associated with plague, and the social stigma extended to any children they might have. Many former plague doctors lived the rest of their lives in complete isolation. The economic consequences of this social rejection were severe. Former plague doctors often faced poverty and homelessness, surviving on charity from religious organizations or by taking up residence in abandoned buildings left empty by plague outbreaks. Some became beggars or vagrants, wandering from town to town in search of communities that didn't know their history. The Brotherhood of the Damned. Some former plague doctors formed informal communities with others who had shared their experiences. These groups provided mutual support and understanding that was impossible to find in mainstream society. But they also reinforced the sense of being permanently separated from normal human life. These communities of former plague doctors often developed their own customs and beliefs that reflected their unique experiences with mass death. They would share information about herbal treatments, discuss their continuing nightmares and psychological symptoms, and provide care for each other when mainstream medical practitioners refused to treat them. Some of these communities became semi-permanent settlements on the outskirts of major cities, creating what amounted to colonies of social outcasts. These settlements often attracted other marginalized people, former criminals, excommunicated, clergy, and social misfits, creating communities of people who had been rejected by mainstream society. Religious implications and spiritual crisis. The medieval worldview held that disease was divine punishment for sin, which created profound spiritual crises for plague doctors who had survived intimate contact with plague. Many struggled with questions about their relationship with God and their spiritual status. Some former plague doctors became religious extremists, joining flagellant movements or other radical religious groups that emphasized penance and suffering. They believed that their survival required constant self-punishment to atone for their contact with divine judgment. Others lost their faith entirely, becoming early examples of medieval skepticism about divine justice and religious authority. Having seen entire communities of devout believers die while they themselves survived, many plague doctors began to question fundamental religious teachings about virtue, sin, and divine protection. The Catholic Church's attitude toward former plague doctors was ambiguous and often contradictory. While their service was officially sanctioned and necessary, many clergy viewed them with suspicion and refused them normal religious services. Some former plague doctors were denied last rites, marriage ceremonies, or burial in consecrated ground. The legacy of service, despite the horrible personal costs. Some former plague doctors attempted to use their unique experiences to improve medical knowledge and plague prevention. They wrote treatises on plague symptoms and treatments, though their work was often dismissed by mainstream medical authorities who were suspicious of their methods and motivations. A few former plague doctors became teachers or advisors for future plague outbreaks, sharing their practical knowledge about protective procedures and patient management. However, Their social status made it difficult for them to gain official recognition or influence medical policy. Many former plague doctors spent their remaining years documenting their experiences, creating some of the most detailed and harrowing accounts of plague outbreaks that have survived to the present day. These writings provide invaluable historical insight into medieval medical practice and the human cost of epidemic disease. The psychological profiles that emerge from these historical accounts show remarkable consistency with modern understanding of trauma and post-traumatic stress. Former plague doctors exhibited symptoms that today would be recognized as severe PTSD, including flashbacks, anxiety disorders, depression, and social withdrawal. The final reckoning, death, legacy, and the end of an era. The vast majority of plague doctors died during their service. But even their deaths were different from those of ordinary plague victims. Their unique position in medieval society meant that their final moments and the disposal of their bodies followed special procedures that reflected both practical concerns and deep-seated fears about contamination and supernatural consequences. The statistics of survival historical records suggest that fewer than 20% of plague doctors survived their first major outbreak assignment. Those who did survive long enough to see the end of an epidemic often died within months or years from complications related to their exposure to disease, malnutrition, and the physical demands of their work. The death rate among plague doctors was actually higher than among the general population during plague outbreaks. Despite their protective equipment and medical knowledge, this paradox reflected the fact that plague doctors had sustained intimate contact with the most severely infected patients, while ordinary citizens could sometimes avoid exposure through isolation or flight. Different regions and time periods showed variations in survival rates. Plague doctors working in smaller communities with lower population density had slightly better survival chances than those working in major cities, where the concentration of infected patients was overwhelming. However, even in the best circumstances, the mortality rate among plague doctors exceeded 70%. The manner of their deaths when plague doctors died from plague. Their deaths often followed a particularly rapid and severe progression. The sustained exposure to infected patients meant that when the disease finally overcame their protective measures, they typically received massive infectious doses that killed them within days rather than the weeks that ordinary victims might survive. Many plague doctors died not directly from plague, but from exhaustion, malnutrition, and other diseases that their weakened immune systems couldn't fight off. The physical demands of working 16 to 18 hours per day in heavy leather clothing, combined with poor nutrition and constant stress, left them vulnerable to a wide range of medical conditions. Suicide was surprisingly common among plague doctors, though it was rarely recorded officially due to religious prohibitions. The psychological strain of their work, combined with the social isolation and survivor's guilt, led many to take their own lives rather than continue their service or face the prospect of post-plague social rejection. Some plague doctors died from violence perpetrated by desperate family members who blamed them for failed treatments or by superstitious communities that viewed them as harbingers of death. These violent deaths were often covered up by local authorities who didn't want to discourage other men from accepting plague doctor positions. The disposal of plague doctor bodies. When a plague doctor died, disposing of his body presented unique challenges that reflected medieval fears about contamination and supernatural consequences. The elaborate protective costume that had to find his life became a burial shroud that required special handling procedures. Plague doctor bodies were typically burned rather than buried, despite religious objections to cremation. The leather costume, medical instruments, and personal possessions were usually burned along with the body to prevent any possibility of contamination. These funeral pyres were often conducted outside city limits to avoid spreading infection. Some communities developed elaborate rituals for disposing of plague doctor bodies that combined practical health measures with religious ceremonies designed to protect the community from supernatural consequences. These rituals often included prayers, incense burning, and the scattering of protective herbs around the cremation site. The families of deceased plague doctors were often denied normal grieving processes and memorial services. Many plague doctors were cremated without witnesses, and their ashes were scattered in unmarked locations to prevent the creation of contaminated burial sites that might pose ongoing health risks. The end of the plague doctor era, the profession of plague doctor gradually disappeared as medical understanding advanced and public health measures improved. The development of more effective quarantine procedures, better sanitation systems, and the gradual decline in major plague outbreaks reduced the demand for these specialized medical practitioners. The last recorded plague doctors worked during the Marseille plague outbreak of 1720 to 1722, representing the end of a profession that had existed for nearly 400 years. By this time, medical knowledge had advanced enough that the traditional plague doctor costume and treatments were recognized as largely ineffective. The decline of the plague doctor profession also reflected broader changes in European society, including improved medical education, better understanding of disease transmission, and the development of more sophisticated public health bureaucracies that could manage epidemic outbreaks without relying on individual practitioners. Historical legacy and modern understanding. Modern medical historians recognize plague doctors as representing both the best and worst of medieval medicine. Their willingness to treat patients when others fled showed remarkable courage and dedication. But their treatments often caused more harm than good. The plague doctor costume, while largely ineffective against actual disease transmission, did provide some protection and demonstrated an early understanding of the importance of barrier protection in medical practice. The concept of protective medical equipment worn by plague doctors influenced the development of modern surgical masks, hazmat suits, and other protective gear. The detailed records kept by plague doctors provide invaluable historical data about medieval disease outbreaks, population mortality, and social responses to epidemic disease. These records have been crucial for modern epidemiologists studying historical disease patterns and their social consequences. The human cost. The true legacy of plague doctors lies not in their medical effectiveness, but in their human sacrifice. These men, whether volunteers or conscripts, accepted positions that virtually guaranteed their own deaths in order to provide some measure of care and comfort to dying communities. The psychological and social costs borne by plague doctors and their families represent one of history's most extreme examples of occupational sacrifice. They gave up not just their lives, but their humanity, becoming living symbols of death and disease in order to serve their communities. Modern healthcare workers facing epidemic diseases like Ebola, COVID-19, and other infectious conditions face many of the same psychological and social challenges that confronted medieval plague doctors. The isolation, fear, and social stigma associated with treating dangerous infectious diseases continue to affect medical professionals today. Final reflections as we conclude our journey through the horrific life of medieval plague doctors. We're left with questions about courage, sacrifice, and the human capacity for both cruelty and compassion. These men existed at the intersection of medicine and death, hope and despair, community service and social rejection. Their story reminds us that progress in medical knowledge and public health has been built on the sacrifices of countless individuals who risked everything to care for the sick and dying. The plague doctor's willingness to walk among the dead and dying, despite primitive protective equipment and ineffective treatments, represents a form of courage that few humans have ever been called upon to demonstrate. Perhaps most importantly, the story of plague doctors illustrates how epidemic disease affects not just individual health, but the entire fabric of society. The fear, superstition, and social breakdown that accompanied medieval plagues created conditions where ordinary men could be transformed into figures of terror and symbols of death. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember these forgotten heroes who sacrificed their lives, their sanity, and their humanity in humanity's long struggle against disease and death. Their legacy lives on in every healthcare worker who chooses to care for dangerous patients, in every researcher who studies infectious disease, and in our modern understanding that epidemic disease is a challenge that requires both individual courage and collective response. The plague doctors are gone, but their message remains in the face of overwhelming death and suffering. Some people will always step forward to help, regardless of the personal cost. That willingness to serve others in their darkest hours represents the best of human nature, even when it emerges from the worst of human circumstances.